One of the things that I have thought each time I've watched this film, and my personal answer to this has been different each time, is what are we now supposed to do with what Tad made? What should we be taking away from this? And I'd like to ask you what you want us today in 2013.
Well, yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out today. You know, it really means a lot. Thank you to Sabrina and the Asian Society for bringing all of us together. And to, yeah, hopefully you guys were able to engage with the film in some way. I think that's just the main goal, was to get specifically a new audience to the subject matter, to somehow engage, whether it's you know, being able to project their own experiences to something they saw on screen, or even more importantly, maybe being able to visualize something they've always wanted to see but haven't had in their own community or in their own family's experience, and to be inspired. But I think one thing that I did want to do is, with this film, I really did want to focus on the Sansei generation, the third generation Japanese Americans, which is pretty much the children of those who were incarcerated during the camps. Because I really do think it was that generation that really created spaces like this for us to talk about it. Because they didn't necessarily, a lot of them either were very, very young when they went through camp, or weren't even around when the camps happened. It wasn't as much of a traumatic experience. It wasn't as personal or deep to go back there. So it was really because of that generation that we were able to talk about it. History books started recognizing it, and then in the late 80s, the reparation movement and the eventual apology from the government, or not even an apology, the acknowledgement that it had happened, because a lot up to then was a lot of denial, or let's just not talk about it. So I think what I wanted to do was try to inspire younger people to say that, because really the first pilgrimage was done and organized and executed by people college age or younger. So we're talking about 17 to 24. And I think when we talk about history, that generation or that age frame is never talked about. If anything, those are the troublemakers, right? If anything, people have to find solutions to the problems that they create. But you know, I was inspired because when I made the film, I was around that same age. So I really wanted to, you know, not only speaking to the Japanese American community, but to just younger people in general, is that, you know, the mark that you can make now, even as a 20-year-old, can really change history in this country.
So I want to ask both of them a question in a minute, but first of all, it may seem a little interesting and odd to you that someone from the Holocaust Museum is here today while we're talking about American history, something that happened within our own country and nation. But there are so many parallels between these stories that it's quite astounding and pretty horrifying that these two events were taking place at the same time, or very near to the same time. There's a book that we use a lot of times at the Holocaust Museum when we're working with teachers, and it's called Night Father. And I was telling Tad earlier today about it at lunchtime, because one of the things that's hardest for us to understand is how stories are passed from generation to generation, and how we can begin to understand things in our own families and in our wider family communities. And the first short story in this book, Night Father, I cannot remember what the title of it is, but I always remember the first paragraph. And it's written by an author in the voice of a child, a second generation person whose father in this case, is a Holocaust survivor. And the child is saying in this paragraph, "My father has camp." And so I want to ask these two gentlemen, what's your first recollection of camp in the context of what your film is about from when you were children?
Sure, thank you. Before I answer that question, I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank Sabrina Motley and our friends at the Asia Society, as well as our colleagues at the Houston Holocaust Museum, especially Tad Nakamura for coming all the way from LA to join us today. It's a wonderful work. I actually resisted all temptation to look at it on Vimeo and other sources before today. I wanted to be surprised, and I wanted to, you know, kind of see it for the first time. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you very much also for coming out on Sunday to join us, and also happy Lunar New Year to you. My name is Gary Nakamura, and I'm the president of the Japanese American Citizens League. And my own father, George Nakamura, who I'm very lucky to have up in the top corner there, wearing the FW cap. He was.
Can I interrupt for a minute and ask you all to stand up and turn around and acknowledge Mr. Nakamura for his service in the 442nd Battalion? And I stand corrected here, in the Military Intelligence Service, where he did a lot of important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. So my father, George Nakamura, he and his family were interned, uprooted from Central Coastal California in 1942, after Executive Order 9066. And him and his family were all first taken to Santa Anita in the LA area to racetrack, and they had to stay in horse stalls, basically, until their camp in the Arizona desert called Gila River was ready. And that's a Native American reservation. And as it was alluded to in Tad's film about Manzanar, there are 10 wartime relocation authority camps that were established. And they were gigantic camps of about 10,000 people or even more each. And so in our case, the Nakamura family were all interned in Gila River. And I think one of the things, my earliest memories that I have is, I think I was reading through a book, actually that was written, a compilation of stories of what the military intelligence service personnel did during World War II. And the MIS, as they're known, is lesser known to many degrees compared to their counterparts, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Infantry that served in Europe. The main reason being that the MIS were on classified missions, mostly in the Pacific, and in my father's case, the China-Burma-India theater of war. So a lot of their activities were not declassified until the late 70s at the earliest, and throughout the 80s. So I was reading a compilation that was put together in the 80s, one of the first compilations of its kind, that talked about what some of the MIS personnel did, including my father, who served in Yan'an, China, at Mao Zedong's headquarters on a classified mission. And during the book, there are some parts that said, George Nakamura, for example, and his family were, in the internment camp in Arizona. And I excuse me, I'm trying to get over it. Just got over a cold. So I think that was probably the first time I actually read about it, but I wasn't sure. Like it was, stated in Tad's film, I wasn't exactly sure what internment camp meant. Because the word internment was in front of that, I didn't automatically think it was one of those, summer camp deals. But at the same time, it really intrigued me. So that really kind of led to me asking questions. And I was very lucky. My older sister and I were very fortunate because my parents had a library that was stocked with a lot of books, informative books about the Japanese American experience. Michio Eglin's, Days of Infamy, and Bill Hosogawa's books, and a lot of books like that that were just chock full of information. So I started, scouring through some of those. But I think to a greater extent, my older sister and I were very, very fortunate compared to many other sansei's, third-generation Japanese Americans, because my father was very willing to share with us his story and what happened to his family. So, I think maybe when I was in my mid-teens or so, maybe early part of high school, I started really talking to him about, what did he do during the war? He told me about his wartime experience first, and then he went into, what camp was like. But he was in camp for a relatively short period of time, from the time they were evacuated in the spring of 1942 until December of 1940. December of 1942, I guess. So the reason why is because in November of 1942, the U.S. Army realized that they needed Japanese linguists for the army. And so they first came to, ironically enough, they came to the 10 WRA camps seeking volunteers to join the military intelligence service language school. So my father was one of the first 32 young men to volunteer from Gila River, and that was in November 1942. And they kind of took them out very quietly at 5 in the morning in December 1942 because there was some protest against that. And off he went for U.S. Army training. But because he was in camp for a relatively short period of time, I think he was able to share his story more openly with us than had he been there for 2 or 3 years.
Thank you.
Yeah, for me, I'm from Los Angeles, and probably like most Japanese American families all over the country, Japanese families like to do like 2 things, right? They like to go to Vegas, and we like to go fishing, right? And so my family likes to do both, and so we'd always, from LA, we go to the Sierra Mountains up in Mammoth Mountain, and we go fishing. And so in order to drive there from LA to Mammoth, you have to cross the Mojave Desert, and you eventually pass Manzanar. So I got actually exposed to it at a very young age. I remember probably, around, I was probably 6 or 7, and that's when I would get into BB guns. And so my dad we would stop by the highway and to kind of shoot BB guns in the middle of the desert. And at that time, Manzanar, there was no historical site. And so literally the footage that you can see of the old plates and broken, that's how it looked like when I was a kid. And we're talking like 1988, 1987. So this is how recent, I guess, the acceptance of this dark chapter happened, where there was literally still barbed wire fences, and literally the plates and the bowls from the kitchen mess halls were just, abundance out in the desert, in the sand. So it was very real to me. But at the same time, when you're a kid, you see it, everyone's, when I was your age, I walked 3 miles in the snow to get to school, don't complain, go to school, so it was one of those stories, like, yeah, you're here, yeah. But it wasn't really until I got to high school age that I was able to compare, I was taking US history, and then I was able to, then all of a sudden it's relevant because your family's experience is part of American history, which the rest of the class is learning, right? So it becomes, instead of family stories, it becomes American history. And so it really wasn't until that point that I really started to understand exactly what had happened. And also too, realizing that, for example, I was lucky that my parents, Robert Nakamura and Karen Ishizuka, both worked at the Japanese American National Museum. And so they've done about 4 projects on incarceration. And one of them was documenting home videos or collecting home videos that people took in the camps themselves. And as a teenager, it's the little things that really resonated to me. Little things like, if you had a girlfriend, you had no privacy, right? These are things that like a 16-year-old doesn't care about necessarily, like, without due process of law, but little things of like, wow, if you had a girlfriend, you literally have no privacy, and you're in the middle of a desert. Another story that really got to me because I was playing football was, I forgot the name, but he was a football player for the University of Washington, Japanese American football player, and he was, his family went to camp, so he had to go to camp with them, and then that year, UW made it to the Rose Bowl, and so again, what's important to a 16-year-old is, football, girls, whatever, and then, so to me, again, it became the political turned into the personal, and that's actually the first time where I saw the tragedy. I was like, wow, he couldn't go to this Rose Bowl. To me, that was way more tragic than things I had heard, on a very superficial level. But, and then again, in college, I became an Asian American Studies major, and then, was able to study the camps in a much more bigger detail, and therefore was able to learn about similar experiences in other communities. And I think that was one thing that I was privilege to have is to grow up with the knowledge of the camps, at least by the time I got to college. So when I learned about other people and other communities, struggles for justice, I was able to build that bridge pretty quickly.
So this is a really fascinating and gritty history. And I'm so glad in the film that you included so much movement of the sand and the dirt. I don't know how many of you noticed that, but when you read memoirs of people that were in the camps, that's one thing they often talk about. How really, truly uncomfortable it was. The sand, the weather, the heat in the summer, the bitter, bitter cold in the winter without having adequate clothes. Like in the Holocaust, when people talk about their experiences in the Holocaust, one of the most common things they talk about is hunger. And this was an issue in the camps, but an issue for the reason of basic hunger, but also because the food that people were fed was utterly different from what they were used to eating, and people were really sick. When I first learned about this, one of the things that was most shocking to me was the ability to take care of your needs, to go to the bathroom, and how that became a public experience instead of a private experience, and how people were so sick to their stomachs because the food was so different, and that made this experience of being able to go to the bathroom privately even more important and such a loss. So, it's really fascinating to say what you attach to in this, because I used to teach this subject to kids in school. One of the things that was most shocking to them was that you couldn't take your pets with you when you went to the racetrack. When you eventually were going to be relocated, but you didn't know that. You knew you were temporarily relocated and you couldn't take your pets. So that might not seem like a big thing, but for people in the moment, that was a huge thing, depending on your age, like the football. So I wanted to ask you, I don't know how many of you caught that we have very similar family names here, Nakamura, and you also saw Robert Nakamura in the film credits. So, and
we see actually in the film too.
Right, yeah, he talks. But so, did you just make the connection with Tad talking about his father, Robert Nakamura, and that you saw him in the film? And can you talk about your dad and the resources that he brought to the film?
Yeah, I think it was real special. I mean, again, this film was very personal to me because my whole family was incarcerated at Manzanar, including my father, who was 6 years old. My uncle was born there, and so it was very, very personal to me. But even more special than that was that this moment, this specific pilgrimage, really changed my dad's life and gave him a whole career. And what was nice about it is that I was able to use a lot of the photographs that he took. So all the black and white photographs are in the film. He shot himself, and a lot of the black and white footage of the monument, of the plates on the sand, he had shot that himself. So it was very symbolic and really good for me to, in a way, to almost remix his photographs and retell his story, but to a specifically younger generation. And I think it was. I think it was very special in that sense, that, he felt not only was his experience of getting the Nisei to talk about camps in his earlier films, but also too the fact that he was able to document something that he knew was special at that moment personally, but eventually, has now become historical documentation. And I think it really validated the work he had done.
Do you think his parents are proud of him? I'm thinking so. Could you also talk about finding the film footage?
Oh yeah. So one of the big kind of, when you ever make a documentary, especially a historical piece, a big challenge is finding found footage, or either getting rights to that. And one thing that I wanted to do was kind of to create a counter or just alternative view of the camps other than what's been presented, because I think the most common photographs of camps are done by commissioned U.S. government photographers, but probably the most famous is Ansel Adams, right? Because he is the master of black and white photography. But when I look at those photos, and it's the photos in the beginning when Sandy Marshall was talking about how she thought it was a summer camp, I just noticed that they're all smiling. You know, they're really cute, and at the same time, that from a photographic sense, they're all at a low angle looking up, right? So you see someone smiling, all you see is beautiful sky. And all you have to do is tilt the camera up and you would see that that sky is next to barbed wire, next to a desert. You know, and so I thought that, you know, the idea of not only vocabulary, but the idea of image can rewrite history. I felt that, in a way, at least, there's multiple perspectives of camp, but at least the only ones that I was hearing in an educational context were kind of the sanitized versions. It was bad, but we made the best of it. So I really, because the stories that I heard also were very terrible. And so, you know, I think I wanted to show those home videos, at least of the pilgrimage. It shows how cold it is in the winter, and it shows how just desolate and really dark it is. So we found that film is from Ron and Don Rundstrom, two twins that were actually graduate students at UCLA, and they're white. So it was interesting because they felt that they were observers on the pilgrimage because their families hadn't been incarcerated. They felt that their position of power was different. So the best way they could utilize their privilege was to film the pilgrimage versus participate in it.
So I just wanted to add something to what Tad just mentioned, and Mary Lee. I think one of the things that we have to realize is, you know, like Tad just mentioned, there's a sanitized version of what happened during the war. And, you know, you see a wonderful job that Tad did in putting a little clip of the government propaganda that came out. And if you notice the kind of the happy-go-lucky music in the back, it almost seemed like you'd expect cartoon characters to kind of like romp out, you know, out of the middle of nowhere. I mean, it's just almost comical. But we have to realize, when looking back in history, that when the Executive Order 906 was signed by President Roosevelt and the order was executed, each member only was allowed one suitcase to bring with them. So if you imagine, all of a sudden you have 2-week notice saying, okay, you have to come, you know, we're going to move you for your own safety, we're going to move you inland, and guess what? You can't bring anything but one suitcase. I mean, how do you react in a situation like that? It's hard for me to fathom that, you know, how I would have reacted, and it's just remarkable. I think it speaks, you know, so much to the strength, the inner strength that the Japanese American people had during and after World War II, you know, and ultimately being labeled by some sociologists as the model minority. I mean, assimilating into U.S. American society and then really trying to, I mean, work hard and sacrifice for their children. It's just amazing, the resiliency. So that's something I think that our community and the Asian American community could all be very, very proud of, and we really need to remember. One thing I wanted to do is, while we're here, we have several people in our audience today who actually either went through the camping experience themselves or their first-degree relatives, their parents went. So if I could quickly mention them, we have Linda Toyota, whose parents, I believe, mother's family was at Minidoka, and father's family was at Poston. We have Natalie Ong, who's, I believe that her family first went to Manzanar, but to Minidoka. And many of you may actually have seen Natalie before if you don't know her yet. She and her mother are the picture taken of her and her mother when Natalie was an infant at Bainbridge Island, Washington, is one of the very, very famous National Archive photos that you'll see of a lady holding her baby and, you know, on the way to the camp.
And they each have a tag on them.
Yes, exactly, and yes, and they had tags on them. And we have Glenn Gondo, whose parents were both interned at Granada in Colorado. We have Brian Kashiwagi, whom I believe was 3 months old, and he was his family was uprooted from the Seattle, Washington area and interned in Minidoka. And as I mentioned before, George Nakamura, my father, his family went to the Gila River. So, you know, even within our Houston, Texas, community, where we don't have that many Japanese Americans, there is quite a few of us that, have gone through this experience. So it touches us all. And as Tad's film so eloquently talked about, it matters a great deal because going forward, looking back at what happened when 9/11 happened, there was that huge fear, that swept across the nation for Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, thinking, gee, when are they going to come and get us? And one of the things that the former executive director of the National Japanese American Citizens League did, John Tadeishi, he was the very first person in the country to call a press conference the very next day, on September 12th, and basically give warning to the US government that if you try to incarcerate Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, we'll be fighting tooth and nail. So, we really need to remember our past, remember our history, otherwise we're bound to repeat it. So.
Well, there can't be a more powerful way to end our session today than what you just said. And it goes back to the question I asked at the beginning, what do you want us to take away from this? So I'm hoping, and I know Sabrina and our colleagues at Asia Society are hoping that you'll all walk out of here today with questions. This, like all moments of difficult history, is layers and layers and layers of things and questions. If you've never read any of the literature written by people who were interned, or the MIS report that you're talking about, you should go read some of that. Some of the literature and the poetry written during this period is some of the most powerful ways that the English language has ever been used, in my opinion. The court documents, the Supreme Court cases, lots and lots of questions that we should all be asking and aware of. And I want to close by telling you about two photographs that have greatly affected my thinking as an educator and as a citizen of this country. One of them is a really large photograph that's on the wall at the Holocaust Museum 3 blocks down the street. And it shows rows and rows and rows of men on November 10th, 1938, after Kristallnacht, or the November pogroms when Jews were attacked in the streets. And they're standing in a concentration camp called Buchenwald that the Nazis have fully operational and ready to have 30,000 people there coming in one day. And they're silent. You can't see very many guards in the group of people, but you see these nicely dressed men in their outdoor coats standing totally still, most of them looking down. There's a picture from San Francisco from November 1942 when they were rounding up people, and there were also similar pictures from 41, right after the Pearl Harbor attacks, where they're going into the Japanese American communities and taking out male leaders. They didn't do much with the women, to the best of what I've known, but they've taken out all of these leading citizens, and they're there. It's kind of cool in LA or San Francisco that time of the year, and they have winter coats on, and they're standing there. And it could be, they could have taken people from both pictures, and their facial expressions are exactly the same. They've been silenced. And there's such a powerful, powerful part of this story that's about silence and how you break silence down. And that's the part that we all need to think about. How do you break silence down when people's rights have been taken from them? So thank you both for the work that you do all the time. Thank you to the Asia Society for sponsoring this today.